Chapter 2, Nasser and the Silencing of Protest. I said, the graduates will come out of university without work, and they replied, we don't care. We don't care if they sell tamia on the street. They want the degree for its own sake. On July 23, 1952, a group of young army officers overthrew Egypt's constitutional monarchy in a military coup. After a brief leadership struggle in 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser gained control of the new regime and remained its leading force until his death in 1970. For our purposes, the most striking feature of the era, from 1954 to the 1967 June War, was the virtual disappearance of opposition activism among modern, educated, lower middle-class youth. This lull is conspicuous because such youth figured prominently in the opposition movements before 1952 and formed the main base of the reconstituted Islamic movement after Nasser's death. What explains the silence of educated youth in Nasser's Egypt? This chapter contends that Nasser preempted the rise of opposition activism by subordinating political agents, sites, and targets of mobilization to state control. He banned all opposition groups and imposed state control over sites where they had formerly reached out to the mass public. At the same time, the regime robbed such groups of a key constituency through the co-optation of educated lower middle class youth. A close examination of the Nasser era reveals that through a preemptive strategy combining repression, redistribution, and resocialization, authoritarian leaders can diminish their prospects for mobilization to the point that it hardly occurs at all. As chapters 3 and 5 show, chapters 3 through 5 show, it was only after the effectiveness of this strategy declined and was subsequently abandoned that Islamic activism resurfaced among the students and professionals of Egypt's cities and provincial towns. What kind of regime did Nasser establish? And how did it tame one of the most politically volatile sectors of Egyptian society? Authoritarian populism, repression, redistribution, and resocialization. It is useful to examine Egypt under Nasser as an example of broader phenomena that Raymond A. Hinsbush Jr. described as authoritarian populism, a regime type that emerged during the era of decolonization in many states of the Middle East and Africa. It is typically the product of nationalist reaction against imperialism, that is, of struggles for independence or against extroverted independent development. It is also chiefly a phenomena of the early middle stages of development, the product of a challenge by a rising salaried middle class to a traditional upper middle class dominance prior to a large-scale mobilization of the masses. It may grow out of a nationalist movement, occasionally a revolution, frequently a military coup by middle-class officers. Formation of a strong, independent state free of imperialist control is its first priority. In addition, state power is put in the service of economic modernization and reformist redistribution of wealth and opportunity to the middle class and lower classes. Reformist in nature, such regimes stop short of the great transformations of communist societies. Rather than promote radical change and organize mass support, they attempt to reconcile competing interests through populist ideology and massive redistribution. But as Waterbury observed for Egypt, The regime's capacity to simultaneously finance economic growth and distribution eventually becomes strained, and it must either compromise its agenda or seek additional funding from external sources. While Waterbury emphasized the contradictions inherent in the regime's development model, Hinsbush attributed its decline to the growing influence of the private bourgeois and the resurgence of patrimonialism, that is, the appropriation of public office for private ends by the actors of the state and the state itself. Such forces sap the populist authoritarian regime of its reformist potential, leading ultimately to social stabilization and economic liberalization. Nasser's populist authoritarian regime eventually succumbed to profound external and internal pressures for reform. For a time, however, it was extraordinarily successful in securing the political acquiescence, if not outright support, of strategic sectors of the mass public. This absence of overt protest was in part an outcome of repression. After consolidating his own power base, Nasser launched a frontal assault on all organized opposition. By the mid-1950s, all of the country's independent political groups were banned, and those that survived were forced underground. Nasser never managed to eliminate all his opponents, though, as indicated by the underground Islamist cells that were uncovered at various points during his rule. Yet, by subjecting to state control all the country's major public institutions, including its universities, schools, media, and mosques, the regime was able to close off former sites of outreach, limiting the opposition group's access to the mass public. Repression was one bulwark of the Nasser regime, but the disappearance of opposition activism between 1954 and 1967 was not a product of coercion alone. First, it is unlikely that the regime ever achieved the technical capacity to maintain effective surveillance of society at large. And second, it appears to have enjoyed the genuine support of some sectors of society, including a large share of the country's educated youth. In part, this support was a response to Nasser's tremendous personal charisma, yet neither Nasser nor his advisors were prepared to stake the regime's stability on charm alone. Rather, Nasser preempted opposition activism by granting strategic groups a material and symbolic state in the revolutionary order. Although Nasser claimed to represent the oppressed Sha'ab, or people, as a whole, a disproportionate share of state resources was channeled to urban, educated, lower middle class, and middle class youth. The priority accorded them derived less from an assessment of their objective needs than from their perceived strategic importance. That is, Nasser singled out educated, lower class youth for extra entitlements, as well as for extra indoctrination, in order to diffuse their capacity to threaten the regime's survival. Yet rather than following a well-thought-out plan, the regime's efforts at co-optation had an ad hoc quality. in which policy decisions intended to address a specific problem or emanating from a brief period of social experimentation acquired a life of their own. Costly to maintain, the entitlements granted to educated youth proved even more difficult to retract. The social contract. Nasser's policy of state distribution is often referred to as the social contract, according to which the regime provided goods and services to the public in exchange for their political support. To some extent, the term is misleading, as the arrangement was never a bargain entered into voluntarily by equal partners, but was a strategy of co-optation initiated by the regime for its own purposes. Moreover, the term presumes that economic distribution, rather than such factors as charismatic leadership or indoctrination, was the basis of the regime's popularity, a claim that is open to debate. Despite such shortcomings, the term is a useful shorthand for regime policies of distribution targeted at non-elite sectors of Egyptian society. The Nasserist social contract raised popular living standards in several ways. It offered employment in the expanding state sector and provided subsidized food, energy, health, and housing to lower and middle class groups. Because state employment benefits and services were concentrated in the cities, urban residents, including recent migrants from the countryside, profited disproportionately from them. Among the most coveted benefits of the social contract was expanded access to free higher education, and from 1964, the promise to every university graduate of a governmental job. Free higher education and guaranteed state employment opened new avenues of social mobility to the children of lower and middle class Egyptian families, and in doing so, indebted them to the patron state. The expansion of higher education. The Army officers who seized power in 1952 did not start out with an educational plan that emphasized higher education. On the contrary, under such banners as Every Day, a New Primary School, priority was given to universalizing primary education and eradicating illiteracy. By contrast, the regime neglected higher education, cutting budgets and limiting the number of new students. The regime's initial emphasis on primary education may have stemmed from the free officers' commitment to egalitarianism, or their provincial assessment of the country's manpower needs. It most certainly also reflected their reluctance to expand those institutions that had long figured as major sites of political dissent. Soon after consolidating power, Nasser reorganized the universities, banning independent student unions, purging faculty and administration, and posting security police units on campus. After that, he launched a series of reforms increasing popular access to higher education. In 1954, university tuition fees were lowered. Eligibility for university scholarships was expanded, and the education budget was reordered at the expense of primary education. Over the next 8 years, the budget of universities almost quadrupled, while the Ministry of Education's budget little more than doubled. Raising the allocation of higher education from 14% to 22% of the general education budget. Over the Nasser period as a whole, the number of students enrolled in primary education per thousand of population increased by 234%, and the number of students enrolled in higher education rose by 325%. Annual university enrollments climbed from 51,681 in 1952 and 53 to 161,517 in 1969 and 70. The regime's emphasis on higher education after 1954 stemmed in part from the country's growing need for educated manpower, particularly for graduates trained in such fields as engineering, agriculture, and veterinary medicine, to implement the plans for rapid state-led growth. In keeping with the recommendations of various government manpower planning committees, Egypt's output of engineers and other technical specialists increased markedly in the Nasser era. Nonetheless, the expansion of higher education during this period was not solely or even primarily driven by labor considerations, for the university system soon began to overproduce engineers while acute shortages remained for vocationally trained technicians. Against manpower needs estimated at between 1,100 and 2,650 engineers per year. By the early 1970s, more than 5,000 engineers were graduating each year. Two factors propelled educational expansion beyond the country's labor needs. The first was Nasser's ideological commitment to equalizing social and economic opportunities. As he explained in a speech on October 16, 1961, "I want a society in which class distinctions are dissolved through the equality of opportunities to all citizens. I want a society in which the free individual can determine his own position by himself on the basis of his efficiency, capacity, and character." Hence, in addition to filling the manpower needs of the expanding public sector, Egypt's system of higher education was intended to soften, if not completely eliminate, class privilege by providing new opportunities for meritocratic advancement. By reducing fees and expanding the number of secondary students admitted to the university, Nasser put his rhetorical commitments into practice. As Ibrahim Hilmi Abdul Rahman, who served briefly as a minister of planning under Nasser, explained, "Hundreds of technical studies were done. So many efforts at numerical coordination, but it was all nonsense. The goal was to effect social change through education, not economic change." Educational expansion was also a means of winning popular support. Since the reign of Muhammad Ali, and certainly since the days of Cromer and Dunlop, higher education has been closely associated in Egypt with access to prestigious civil service employment. Historically, the domination of the private banking and commerce sectors by Westerners and local minorities had limited native Egyptians' opportunities for entrepreneurship. In this context, the pursuit of higher education rather than private enterprise became the favorite channel of advancement. By 1952, about 1/3 of all Egyptians with a primary school certificate or above were employed by the government. Moreover, according to a system known as the pricing of certificates, from the turn of the century, civil service salaries were determined in accordance with formal academic qualifications. Both the rank at which a graduate entered the civil service and his subsequent opportunities for career advancement hinged on his educational degree. As Abdul Rahman observed, by the time the free officer seized power, education was valued not only as a means of economic advancement, but also as an end in itself. Having an educated son became an achievement regardless of his employment prospects. Similarly, Mahmoud Abdul Fadl wrote, "There is a heavy demand for higher education relative to available places because of the high social status usually associated with such a type of education. Middle class values rather than pure money income prospects may explain much about the job expectations of university graduates in Egypt." By fulfilling the aspirations of lower and middle class youth for access to higher education, Nasser hopes to secure their political support. During the socialist years from 1960 to 1966, Nasser opened up the university system to youth from non-elite backgrounds. Having reduced tuition fees in 1956 and 1961, the government abolished all but nominal fees in 1962, making university education virtually free. Moreover, according to one estimate, nearly 75% of dormitory residents were exempted from paying any room charges, and students were given special privileges, including inexpensive transport, entertainment, and most important, an exemption from military service. Surely, we should not exaggerate the impact of these policies on Egyptian society. Data from UNESCO indicate that gross enrollment ratios at the university level, the ratio of enrolled students to the total age cohort, never exceeded 8% in the Nasser era. But while educational expansion failed to eliminate completely the class biases of the educational system, it did create new avenues for mobility for urban, lower middle and middle class youth who scored sufficiently high on the National Baccalaureate exam to gain admission to the university. As elaborated in later chapters, possession of the coveted Shahada, university degree, not only raised their social status, it also guaranteed them a permanent white-collar job in the state. Nasser's graduate appointment policy. In addition to offering university education free of charge, the Nasser regime instituted a policy guaranteeing every university graduate a government job. Codified in Decree 185 of 1964, the Siyasat al-Ta'yin, or graduate appointment policy, coincided with the dramatic expansion of the public sector in the 1960s. Public employment grew by about 70% from 1962 to 1970, at a time when growth in national employment as a whole did not exceed 20%. Government officials formulating the graduate appointment policy contend that it stemmed less from a sober assessment of the state's manpower needs than from the regime's anxiety about the potential political risks of graduate unemployment. Though instituted on a temporary basis, it quickly became institutionalized and proved difficult to retract. As Kamal ad-Din Hussein, the best-known Minister of Education under Nasser, recalled, in 1962 and 1963, the government saw there were graduates who couldn't find work. I proposed a temporary solution because Nasser wanted a solution. At the time, I led the Executive Council, which included the President and the ministers. I proposed that the government hire those graduates who had not found employment elsewhere. It was never meant to be a permanent solution. At the time, there were certain ministries with a shortage of manpower which needed educated people. For example, there weren't enough teachers for all the schools, so we decided to take graduates and employ them. We did this in 1962 and or 1963, with the majority of them going to the Ministry of Education. It made sense at the time, as it helped fill existing gaps, but it was meant as a temporary measure, not as a permanent one. Then, after I left, it became routine. We only took university graduates. We were afraid if we didn't, they would be sitting out on the street. Nasser looked at it as, why not employ everyone? If a factory can absorb one, it can absorb two. So in 1964, it became a permanent solution. First, the appointment policy involved only university graduates. Then later it was expanded to include 2-year technical institute graduates, and then secondary school graduates. It was part of the socialist thinking. If you have enough bread for 100, feed 150. Everyone will lose a little, but so what? At least you won't have unemployment and you'll be able to absorb more people. Ibrahim Hilmi Abdurrahman agreed that the graduate appointment policy scheme was motivated by short-term political considerations. In its early history, the Ta'yin policy was a political measure. The number of graduates was small at the time. The decision involved no one except those at the apex of the government. It was a decision made by the inner circle because it was regarded as politically sensitive. The Tayin policy was motivated by a fear of political agitation. At the time, we were very afraid of graduate unemployment. Nasser was conscious of this potential problem and considered it very serious because he understood it as a potential source of political instability. After a while, the Tayin policy lost its initial rationale, but once you offer it, it's hard to take it back. It becomes a fact. By 1969, the state employed 450,000 graduates with a secondary school degree or above, including more than 153,300 university degree holders, or roughly 60% of the entire pool of graduates that the country had produced. By 1969, the state employed 450,000 graduates with a secondary school degree or above, including more than 153,300 university degree holders, or roughly 60% of the entire pool of university graduates that the country had produced. This included virtually all of the country's engineers, scientists, and agronomists, more than 87% of its physicians, and 2/3 of its lawyers. The combination of free higher education and guaranteed jobs enabled graduates from non-elite backgrounds to join the ranks of Egypt's new middle class. Such entitlements, however, placed an enormous ongoing financial burden on the state. Furthermore, by diverting scarce resources away from productive investment, they arguably hindered the country's overall economic development. As Robert Mabro noted, the government's appointed policy transferred income to the educated at the cost of future economic growth, ultimately eroding the state's resource base for future distribution. The strategic distribution of resources to educated youth was supplemented during the Nasser era by propaganda efforts to reinforce their loyalty to the regime and to inoculate them against appeals from opposition groups. The resocialization of educated youth. The military officers who seized power in Egypt in 1952 declared that the achievement of full national sovereignty, economic growth, and social justice required political unity and consensus. Claiming that the party conflict in the liberal era had divided the nation and weakened it from within, the free officers dissolved all political parties in 1953. The Muslim Brotherhood was initially exempted from this ban, ostensibly on the grounds that it was not a party, but a non-political religious association. But this exemption was more likely a result of the free officers' reluctance to risk direct confrontation with the country's largest political organization. Relations between the regime and the Brotherhood quickly soured when it became clear that the latter would not acquiesce quietly to military rule. An attempt at Nasser's life in 1954 by a Brotherhood member gave Nasser the pretext he needed to ban the organization and imprison its leaders, thereby bringing to heel the nation's strongest potential agents of anti-regime mobilization. After dismantling Egypt's liberal parliamentary regime, Nasser established a corporatist political system in which interest groups were organized along functional lines and subsumed within the framework of a single official representative body, known as the Liberation Rally from 1953. After dismantling Egypt's liberal parliamentary regime, Nasser established a corporatist political system in which interest groups were organized along functional lines and subsumed within the framework of a single official representative body, known as the Liberation Rally from 1953 to 1958, the National Union from 1958 to 1961, and the Arab Socialist Union from 1962 forward. As part of this transition, all standing professional association boards were dissolved, and beginning in 1958, board members were required to belong to the ruling party. While Egypt's professional associations increased in number and expanded in size as a result of the steady influx of new graduates, they ceased to function as sites of independent political expression. Beginning in the mid-1950s, Egypt's universities also were placed under state control. Independent student unions were banned, and the youth section of the government-sponsored party became the only sanctioned channel for student political activity. At the same time, professors deemed politically suspect were fired or demoted. Then, in the early 1960s, the regime further tightened its grips on universities. A new Ministry of Higher Education was established to coordinate university affairs. Military officers and ex-officers were assigned to senior positions in the university administration, the so-called University Guard, consisting of police troops under control of the Interior Ministry. A new Ministry of Higher Education was established to coordinate university affairs. Military officers and ex-officers were assigned to senior positions in the university administration. The so-called University Guard, consisting of police troops under control of the Interior Ministry, was stationed in each faculty, and both university staff and students were placed under surveillance by security agents. Having converted the country's independent public institutions to appendages of the authoritarian state, Nasser enlisted them to disseminate the regime's propaganda. The most intensive indoctrination efforts were focused on students, who, together with the armed forces, were viewed as the most likely targets of opposition appeals. Although the Nasser regime never developed an elaborate ideology, it appropriated many of the themes and concerns of the opposition movements of the liberal era. Intrinsic to Nasser's social vision was the promise of the meritocratic system of advancement based on the principle of takaful al-furs, equality of opportunity. As articulated in numerous speeches and articles, Nasser's state project constituted an assault on the privileged position of foreigners, Egyptianized minorities, and large landowners, an assault. As articulated in numerous speeches and articles, Nasser's state project constituted an assault on the privileged position of foreigners, Egyptianized minorities, and large landowners, an assault consonant with the sensibilities of the middle and lower echelons of Egypt's native intelligentsia. The regime launched a program of resocialization, or ta'awiyah, in the public schools, as Egyptian political scientist Mahmoud Fakish recalled. In the primary and preparatory schools, strong efforts are directed toward developing a strong loyalty to the regime. Here, the students are repeatedly taught the various patriotic themes of Islam, nationalism, Arabism, and socialism. Textbooks are full of stories about the glory of medieval Islamic heroes and the great Arab nationalist struggle against colonialism and other political and socio-economic injustices that culminated in the 1952 revolution. Based on my own experience with this kind of socialization I underwent in my primary, preparatory, and secondary school years, it would be safe to assume that such ceaseless efforts to bring about an identification with the regime have been somewhat successful. My classmates and I developed a strong sense of identification and pride with Arabism, anti-colonialism, and nationalist leaders of Nasser's caliber. On different occasions, as the government deemed it necessary, we were able to express these feelings and attitudes by demonstrating in support of regime causes and against anti-regime causes, domestic or foreign. Resocialization continued at the university level, where new courses like Arab Society, the July 23rd Revolution, and Socialism were required of all students. In addition, the regime attempted to create a vanguard of youth activists committed to regime goals. To this end, it established several new organizations for university students and graduates, the most significant of which was the Socialist Youth Organization, set up in 1965 after the regime discovered that members of the Muslim Brotherhood, now underground, were again attempting to recruit on campus. Ehrlich estimates that at its peak, the Socialist Youth Organization counted 200,000 members between the ages of 16 and 33. From 1954 to 1967, Egypt's educated strata ceased to function as the country's leading source of opposition activism. Denied an independent voice in the new political order, students and graduates acquiesced to the regime's initiatives, dutifully affirming its achievements at official youth meetings, rallies, and demonstrations. As Malcolm Kerr stated in the mid-1960s, student political activity is now a tame affair organized in support of the regime through various officially inspired channels such as the Arab Socialist Union, which is the sole and official party. Indeed, students and the younger intelligentsia as a whole are now perhaps among the most reliable enthusiasts of the regime. The political loyalty of educated youth ultimately proved contingent on the regime's performance. The political loyalty of educated youth ultimately proved contingent on the regime's performance. The regime's stunning military defeat by Israel in the 1967 war opened a Pandora's box of accumulated frustrations and disappointments. For the first time since the early years of the revolution, students and graduates took to the streets to hold the regime responsible for failing to deliver on its revolutionary promises. The resurgence of opposition activism, the student movement protests of 1967 to 1973. Beginning in 1965 and 1966, the Egyptian economy entered a period of retrenchment, or enkimash, shrinkage, of retrenchment. While Egypt's national income had risen by an average of more than 6% per year from 1960 to 1965, this rate dropped to an average of roughly 1% from 1966 to 1970, due in large part to the huge cost of the Arab, Israel, and Yemen wars. In a period of economic contraction, the earning power of graduates positioned at the base of the bureaucratic pyramid declined. While university graduates continued to enter the civil service at a higher grade than did less educated groups, many among them, and especially those who lacked technical expertise, swelled the ranks of the Lumpensalariat, the army of white-collar workers struggling to maintain the appearance, if not the reality, of a middle-class lifestyle. In 1965, Malcolm Kerr described the plight of these strata in particularly vivid terms. Such graduates constitute a large and rapidly growing group whose skills are largely substandard and unwanted, and whose native talents are mediocre, but whose sights have been trained since childhood on the attainment of a dignified job carrying economic rewards and social prestige. The disappointments are naturally sharp, as these thousands of not-so-bright young men in their soiled collars and cheap suits eke out a shabby and insecure, but desperately respectable existence on £10 a month as minor clerks, bookkeepers, school teachers, and journalists. They are assured from time to time in the press and in the president's speeches that as educated men, they are the vanguard of the nation's progress. But they are impotent to fashion even their own progress. and they can only listen anxiously to the officially propagated theme of equal and widening opportunities under the new Socialist Economic Development Plan, which ambitiously pledges to double the national income in 10 years. Costly to maintain and politically difficult to retract, the social contract began to deliver less and less as an instrument of political control. At the same time, Nasser's heavy-handed tactics in dealing with any form of political opposition generated resentment. By the mid-1960s, graduates began to exhibit signs of a politics of withdrawal, a retreat into passivity, and non-involvement in public affairs. Observers of the period note the preoccupation of university students with sports, especially football. Others stress the visible signs of negativism, el-salbiya, frustration, and despair. This silent undercurrent of frustration did not translate into overt protest before 1967. Although a small number of alienated youth became active in underground Marxist or Islamist cells, the majority simply abstained from any form of political involvement. This pattern was not disrupted until the regime's crushing military defeat by Israel in the 1967 war. The defeat sparked sporadic waves of popular strikes, sit-ins, and demonstrations, culminating in the massive student uprising of 1972 and 73. The first major uprising against the regime occurred in February 1968, beginning with a spontaneous demonstration by industrial workers in the Cairo suburb of Helwan, protesting the light sentences received by senior military officers held responsible for Egypt's defeat in the 1967 war. Students soon joined the uprising, marching out of the gates of the universities into the streets of Cairo and Alexandria for the first time since 1954. The reappearance of opposition activism thus occurred during a serious political crisis in which not only the officers, but in a sense, the regime itself was on trial. What permitted such opposition activism to continue beyond the immediate aftermath of the war was the reconstitution of an independent student movement on Egyptian university campuses. Although it was industrial workers who initiated the collective protests in 1968, it was university students who sustained the wave of protests over the next few years. At the same time, student activists were self-conscious about their position as the country's only vocal opponents of the regime's policy. As Ahmed Abdullah wrote, the students' sense of their own power after 1967 was influenced by the fact that they were virtually alone in challenging the existing authorities. How did the universities reemerge as an important site of opposition activism? After the February 1968 uprising, Nasser made a series of critical concessions to students which broadened the space for independent political expression on the university campuses. The authority of the University Guard was reduced, a new student newspaper was approved, and a more permissive legal framework for student activities was established by presidential decree. Such reforms created new structures of opportunity for protests on university campuses at a time when other institutional arenas remained tightly controlled from above. The prominent role of students in the protests of the 1968-1973 period was also a function of their high level of political consciousness, paradoxically a result of the regime's own ideological outreach. It was the students who had been the most thoroughly socialized in the goals of Nasser's revolution, and who were therefore the most disillusioned when its leaders appeared unable or unwilling to achieve them. By indoctrinating a generation of educated youth in the ideas of anti-imperialism and socialism, the Nasser regime had created the very cadres that would ultimately turn against it. Three aspects of the 1968-1972 wave of collective protests distinguish it from later patterns of Islamic activism. First, this protest occurred against the backdrop of enormous disruptions at the highest levels of the authoritarian state. Including military defeat, the death of Nasser in 1970, and the assumption of power by the lesser-known Anwar Sadat. As Theda Skocpol argued in her seminal work on revolution, military defeat and crisis at the highest echelons of the state apparatus can create new space for political protests in authoritarian situations, temporarily paralyzing the regime's capacity for repression. One could argue that it also creates space by triggering a perceptual breakthrough in which the legitimacy of the regime suddenly is open to doubt. A second defining characteristic of the opposition activism of this period was the leading role of the left. Leftists of various ideological strands, Marxists, Nasserists, communists, and independent, were at the forefront of organized protests during this period and constituted the most active and energetic political force on university campus more generally. In part, this reflects the ideological hegemony of secular nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism in this period, not only in Egypt but also in other Arab states and in the Third World at large. Moreover, the ideological proximity of leftist groups to the regime itself positioned them to exploit most fully the new structures of opportunity that emerged after the war, both inside and outside official party and in youth organizations. A third characteristic of this wave of collective protests was its domination by supranational issues. Although the student protesters had a long list of demands, including calls for greater freedom of expression and renewed commitment to social justice, their foremost demand was for a military confrontation to end Israel's occupation of Egyptian and other Arab territory. The primacy of supranational issues is suggested by the fact that the resumption of hostilities with Israel in the War of October 1973 was followed by a period of relative calm. Beginning in the mid-1970s and accelerating in the 1980s and early 1990s, a sea change took place in the political orientations and behavior of educated Egyptian youth. First, and most striking, was the replacement of the left by the reformist wing of the Islamist movement as the country's leading opposition force. Although calls for political freedom, social justice, and confrontation with Zionism and imperialism could still be heard, they were henceforth cast in an Islamic idiom. Furthermore, the popular organizations of the left atrophied at the same time that Islamic groups and associations expanded their scope and influence. A second major transformation was the spillover of opposition activism from the universities into wider arenas of public life, in which Islamists established independent religious, cultural, and service organizations, acquired their own independent press and publishing houses, and gained control of the country's leading professional associations. Finally, the forms of opposition activism changed as well. Rather than being expressed in a series of high-profile demonstrations directed against a regime in crisis, Islamic activism assumed the form of gradual institution and building. Islamic activism assumed the form of gradual institution building and persuasion. While less visible and dramatic than the wave of collective protests from 1968 to 1972, Islamic outreach since the mid-1970s facilitated the entry of citizens into opposition politics after the authoritarian state's power had reconsolidated. How the Islamists managed to mobilize educated youth within the framework of a stable authoritarian state is explored in the next chapters. Conclusion. Some observers, including many Islamists, explain the absence of opposition activism under Nasser as an outcome of repression. Without denying that both the exercise and threat of state violence played a role, I contend that the country's educated youth were also silenced by their economic, political, and ideological incorporation by the Nasser regime. That is, the regime not only suppressed potential agents and sites of mobilization, but also used the state apparatus to inoculate potential targets of mobilization against opposition groups' appeals. While successful in the short run, the regime's co-optation of educated youth proved unsustainable in the long run. At the end of the Nasser era, in a context of economic recession, military defeat, and political crisis, the silenced sectors of society again found their voice. The collective protest that erupted in the aftermath of military defeat was not a popular rejection of Nasserism so much as a reaction against the regime's failure to deliver, underscoring the risks associated with linking the regime's legitimacy so closely to its performance. Beginning in the mid-1970s, Nasser's successors attempted to devise a new formula of legitimacy, one in which limited rights to participation were offered as a substitute for material and symbolic gains. The regime led political and economic liberalization, however, served less to forge new ties between the state and educated youth than to deepen their mutual disengagement, thus paving the way for the latter's mobilization by Islamic groups.